We know that in 2024, Ukraine spent more than $1 billion on defensive fortifications in total. These cities have remained a critical defensive point for Ukraine.
On April 2nd, the 52nd Artillery Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces posted a routine social media update about its equipment. Buried inside that post, almost as an afterthought, was a weapon that changes everything about how this war ends. A 203mm M110 self-propelled howitzer, American-made, Cold War era, officially retired by the United States military decades ago. And now it is sitting on Ukrainian soil, pointed directly at Russian positions. Putin had no idea this was coming. His generals had no contingency for it, and even Ukraine itself did not fully anticipate what America had just handed them. Because this is not just an old artillery piece being dusted off and shipped east. This is a weapon that fires a 90-kilogram shell, nearly 2 to 100 pounds of explosive force, up to 30 kilometers. Into Russian command centers, into ammunition depots, into the hardened positions that Russia believed were safely out of Ukraine's reach. America built this weapon decades ago, maintained it through decades of alliance relationships across NATO, and right now, it is about to make everything Russia thought it knew about this war completely wrong. But here is what makes this moment truly remarkable. The M110 was not designed for a war like this one. It was designed for a war exactly like this one. Because Russia is not fighting with 21st century tactics. Russia is fighting the way the Soviet Union fought, and America built the perfect answer to that threat 60 years ago. This is what happens when American military investment meets the exact enemy it was always designed to destroy. To understand why the arrival of the M110 howitzer matters so profoundly, you need to understand the artillery problem Ukraine has been fighting with for the last 4 years. Modern artillery warfare is built on layers. You need different weapons for different distances and different targets. Short range for assaulting infantry, medium range for armor concentrations, long range for the command nodes, supply lines, and ammunition depots that keep an enemy offensive alive and moving forward. Pull out any one of those layers and the entire system develops gaps that a determined enemy can exploit again and again. Ukraine has fought this war with a serious gap in its long-range heavy artillery layer. Its domestically produced Bodana howitzer handles precision strikes with genuine skill. The RM-70 Vampire rocket system tears through equipment concentrations and troop formations with devastating effect. But for hardened targets sitting deep behind Russian lines, targets built specifically to absorb punishment and keep functioning through sustained attacks, Ukraine has needed something with more raw destructive power than either of those systems can deliver. The answer was sitting in a Greek military storage facility the entire time. And here is the part that surprised even Ukraine's own military planners. In October 2025, Greece approved the transfer of 60 M110 howitzers to Ukraine, along with 150,000 shells, through a deal valued at roughly $230 million routed through the Czech Republic. 60 artillery systems, 150,000 rounds, including 50,000 high-explosive shells, 40,000 rocket-assisted rounds capable of reaching 30 kilometers, and 30,000 each of dual-purpose cluster munitions and improved conventional munitions developed specifically for this weapon system during its decades of American service. At roughly $599,000 per howitzer and approximately $1,300 per shell, Ukraine just acquired one of the most cost-effective increases in destructive capability of the entire war. Russia pays far more to replace what one of these shells destroys than Ukraine paid for the shell itself. America built this weapon. Greece maintained it for 4 decades as its primary long-range artillery solution. And now it belongs to Ukraine, and this is where everything changes. America backed them fully. Greece has operated the M110A2 since the early 1980s. At its peak, the Greek armed forces held approximately 145 units. As Greece modernized towards standard 155mm NATO systems, the M110 became surplus to requirements. But surplus to Greece does not mean obsolete on a battlefield. It means opportunity for a nation fighting a war where raw, destructive firepower matters more than interoperability with alliance logistics systems. Ukraine recognized that opportunity immediately, and the deal moved fast. But why does a weapon retired by the United States military in the 1990s still matter on a 21st century battlefield? Because Russia is fighting a 21st century war using strategies from the 1950s, Putin's forces have relied on a brutally simple approach throughout this conflict: mass infantry, mass armor, overwhelming numbers directed at Ukrainian defensive positions, with the expectation that sheer volume of men and equipment will eventually grind through whatever stands in the way. It is an approach that has cost Russia catastrophically in both personnel and equipment across 4 years of grinding attritional warfare. But it has also exposed a very specific vulnerability in Ukraine's artillery coverage that Russian commanders have learned to exploit. When Russia masses troops for an assault, it creates exactly the kind of target the M110 was designed to destroy: dense concentrations of personnel and equipment in a relatively confined geographic area, moving toward prepared Ukrainian positions with predictable timing and predictable routes. Nothing about destroying that target type requires a modern weapon. It requires raw firepower delivered accurately at range. And the M110 provides 90 kilograms of explosive force per shell every single time, at distances up to 30 kilometers with rocket-assisted munitions. Against the kind of massed formations Russia keeps sending toward Ukrainian lines, that is not an old weapon being repurposed out of desperation. That is a perfectly matched predator for the exact prey Ukraine needs to destroy. And here is the part that makes Russian commanders genuinely nervous about what just arrived on the battlefield. The 52nd Artillery Brigade that received the first M110S was already operating one of the most sophisticated combined arms artillery systems in the Ukrainian military. The Bodana self-propelled howitzer handles precision long-range strikes against static targets with accuracy that has repeatedly surprised Russian forces. The RM-70 Vampire handles large fire missions against equipment concentrations and troop formations pushing forward through Ukrainian kill zones. Now the M110 sits alongside both of those systems, filling the critical gap that existed between them. The Vampire handles assaulting units and equipment in the near fight. The M110 destroys hardened targets and reinforced positions at the rear of those assaults, eliminating the command infrastructure and ammunition supply that keeps Russian advances moving. The Bodana strikes deep behind Russian lines where future offensives are being organized and supplied, making tomorrow's Russian attacks weaker before they ever begin. 3 weapons, 3 distinct layers, 0 gaps in coverage. Consider what this means in practical terms for a Russian battalion commander planning an assault on Ukrainian defensive positions. Previously, his rear area command post, his ammunition resupply point, and his troop staging area sat at distances he considered safe from Ukrainian artillery. The Bodana could reach some of those targets. The Vampire could not reach them with the accuracy needed. The M110 reaches all of them, comfortably, with enough explosive force per round to render a command post non-functional with a single accurate strike. Russia walked into the Kharkiv and Kramatorsk sectors, believing it understood the artillery threat it would face. The M110 just rewrote that threat assessment entirely, and Russia has no fast answer for what just changed. But none of this matters unless the weapon can actually be sustained on the battlefield. So let us talk about what Ukraine received beyond the 60 howitzers themselves. The ammunition package that arrived alongside the M110S tells you exactly how Ukraine plans to use this weapon. 50,000 plus M106 high-explosive rounds for direct destructive power against personnel concentrations and lightly armored vehicles. 40,000 M650 rocket-assisted rounds that extend the M110's reach to 30 kilometers, putting Russian logistics hubs and command centers that previously felt safe well inside the engagement envelope. 30,000 M509A1 dual-purpose cluster munitions for area denial against massed infantry. 30,000 meters 404 improved conventional munitions for precision engagement of specific high-value targets. Each shell category serves a different battlefield purpose. Together, they give Ukraine's artillery commanders flexibility that a single ammunition type could never provide. The M110 becomes a different weapon depending on what shell is loaded. High explosive for direct assault on fortified positions. Rocket assisted for deep strikes against the infrastructure sustaining Russian offensives. Cluster for breaking up massed infantry before they reach Ukrainian lines. Precision munitions for the targets worth a dedicated engagement. 150,000 shells at $1,300 each. against Russian equipment that costs tens of thousands of dollars per unit to replace, and that Russia's degraded industrial base is struggling to produce fast enough to cover its battlefield losses. The economics of this exchange favor Ukraine dramatically. Every shell the M110 fires costs Russia far more to absorb than it costs Ukraine to fire. That is not just a military advantage, that is a strategic one. Now consider the specific terrain where these weapons have been deployed, and why that matters so critically for the outcome of the next phase of this war. The 52nd Artillery Brigade, currently operating in the Kharkiv and Kramatorsk sectors of eastern Ukraine. Kramatorsk is not a random location. It is one of the 4 major cities comprising what military analysts call the Donetsk Fortress Belt, a defensive line stretching approximately 50 kilometers along the H-20 highway corridor that Ukraine has been systematically reinforcing since Russia's original campaign of aggression in approximately 2014. Kramatorsk has to hold. If it falls, Russia gains a strategic foothold in the northern anchor of the Donetsk Fortress Belt that compromises Ukraine's entire defensive architecture across the region. For over a decade, Ukraine has poured engineering resources, fortification materials, and military preparation into making Kramatorsk the most difficult urban objective any attacking force could face. And now M110 howitzers are sitting in that sector. Ukraine's kill zones already represent one of the video KBC ITZ most effective defensive innovations of this entire war. Dense networks of anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth barriers, anti-personnel mines, barbed wire obstacle fields, and drone surveillance corridors that force Russian forces to either fight through a prepared killing ground accepting catastrophic losses, or detour around it into open terrain where they become exposed to artillery waiting precisely for that moment. That detour is where the M110 changes everything. When Russian forces route around a kill zone into open ground, they inevitably bunch together, moving quickly through exposed terrain. Artillery observers track that movement. Fire missions are called in, and 90-kilogram shells start arriving at the rate a trained M110 crew can sustain under combat conditions. Nothing in Russia's current tactical playbook has a clean answer for that equation. Here is what this development means for America, and it is the part that most coverage never reaches. The M110 howitzer is an American weapon, designed by American engineers, built in American factories. It entered service in 1963, specifically to counter Soviet armored formations expected to pour through the Fulda Gap into Western Europe. 6 decades later, that same weapon is destroying Russian forces using exactly the massed armor and infantry formations the M110 was designed to defeat. What often gets overlooked is what this reveals about the long-term value of American defense investment. The United States spent billions developing and producing the M110 system during the Cold War. Those weapons moved into Allied stockpiles across NATO, maintained and ready, forming the heavy artillery backbone of countries like Greece for 4 decades. American investment did not disappear when the weapons left American service. It continued generating military capability inside the alliance. Every American taxpayer who funded this military capability across 6 decades of defense budgets should understand what that investment is doing right now on the Ukrainian steppe. It is landing on Russian positions and making Putin's offensive calculations dramatically more expensive with every shell fired. Our engineers designed something so fundamentally sound that it remains lethal against the exact threat it was created to defeat 60 years later. That is not an accident. That is what American military engineering looks like when it is done right. For 60 years, the M110 waited for an enemy that fights exactly the way Russia fights. Putin gave Ukraine that enemy. America gave Ukraine the weapon: 60 howitzers, 150,000 shells, 90 kilograms of explosive force per round, 30 kilometers of reach into Russian-held territory. Russia spent 4 years building its offensive doctrine around a specific understanding of what Ukraine's artillery could reach and how hard it could hit. That understanding was accurate for what Ukraine had before April 2nd. It is no longer accurate. The 52nd Artillery Brigade is already in the field. The M110s are already operational. 85 more potentially remain in Greek stockpiles. Additional transfer discussions are already underway through the framework that allows Ukraine's NATO allies to purchase American weapons directly for Ukrainian battlefield use. For 60 years, this weapon sat in Allied arsenals waiting for an enemy that fights exactly the way Russia fights today. Massed formations, predictable advances, hardened rear positions that standard artillery cannot reach economically. Putin handed Ukraine that enemy. America handed Ukraine the weapon built specifically to defeat it. Did Russia just walk its entire spring offensive directly into the trap that American engineering set for it 60 years ago? Or is there still a move left that changes this equation before it plays out completely? Drop your answer below. I read every single comment. If you want daily coverage that does not sugarcoat what is actually happening, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I post every single day and I am not stopping.